Hook 10. He slammed a mafia capo's face into the table just for looking at her wrong. 6 months ago, she was an invisible maid making minimum wage, secretly feeding an antidote to a paralyzed mob boss. Now, she's wearing emerald silk and diamonds, ruling the entire New York underworld by his side. When an arrogant rival family member disrespects her weight at a peace summit, the revived king shows everyone exactly what happens when you insult the woman who dragged him out of the grave. It is 3 in the morning, the hour a restless city slips into unconsciousness and lets its darkest sociopathies breathe. Dominic Costello, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist and New York's apex predator, decays in his silk sheets. The clinical tragedy is the absolute absence of grief. The streets misdiagnose his condition as an illness, but today, you and I are going to examine the terrifying truth together. The pathology of this empire rests on Bridget, a traumatized cleaning woman treated like a phantom. She alone registers the poison. Suddenly, an invisible subject holds the fading pulse of a kingpin in her soapy hands. It reinforces a simple psychological lesson. Life always makes the most overlooked variables the most dangerous ones of all. Let us dissect the shadows. The Costello mansion is a freezing monument to malignant paranoia. The imported marble demands delicate care, while thick walls absorb the echoes of whispered death threats. Bridget understands the ugly reality of this behavioral sink far better than the sociopaths who claim it. She pushes her heavy cart down a hallway. The squeaking wheels mimic a lonely cry, yet the subjects around her shows zero empathy. These men only acknowledge her existence when a dark red stain requires scrubbing from the floorboards. At 28, she exhibits severe exhaustion, carrying an emotional weight that crushes her physical frame. It teaches us a quiet, tragic truth. Sometimes, the heaviest psychological burdens we carry are the ones nobody else ever takes the time to notice or diagnose. In a syndicate fixated on superficial status symbols, Bridget represents a total anomaly. She wears a dull, gray uniform, her hair pulled into a tight knot. She knows exactly what these violent enforcers perceive when their eyes slide over her. They project total insignificance onto her. But here is a profound psychological lesson that rewrites the power dynamic. Sometimes, being completely overlooked provides the ultimate tactical advantage in a room full of predators. These men casually verbalize bloody extortion rackets right over her bowed head. Their narcissistic blindness makes them assume the hired help lacks basic cognitive function. They forget that the traumatized subjects who scrub away their sins always end up holding their deepest, darkest secrets. The cartel soldiers lean against the velvet wallpaper, exhaling cigar smoke into the stagnant air. They barely shift their weight to let her pass. To them, Bridget lacks basic human classification, functioning merely as an inanimate object in their violent environment. A harsh voice snaps through the haze, ordering her to scrub the baseboards. Bridget registers Vincent Romano, the underboss and Dominic's cousin. He wears a charcoal suit, his eyes shining with a pathological arrogance that never manifested before the alpha male fell ill. Bridget instantly drops her chin, adopting the physical posture of a submissive servant to perfection. It reveals a fatal behavioral flaw. Unchecked narcissistic pride will always blind a foolish man to the quiet. Lethal threats standing right in his line of sight. Vincent does not offer her the baseline validation of a second glance. He pivots to his enforcer, exhibiting grandiose delusions as he brags the docks will fall under his control by Thursday. He actively conditions his men to lie, demanding they feed the paralyzed boss a false reality. The erosion of authority is staggering. Dominic Costello was once a cold-blooded tactician who seized the underworld throne at 30. His sharp eyes previously caught every micro-expression. Yet 6 months ago, the untouchable Alpha collapsed into a trapped prisoner inside his own opulent ward. It teaches a deeply painful psychological truth. Betrayal is rarely a sudden, violent attack from a stranger. It is usually a slow, calculated poison poured by the very people standing in your inner circle. Analyzing Dominic's physical deterioration is agonizing. A subject who once crushed rival organizations lacks the motor function to lift a glass of water. Down on her knees, Bridget observes Dr. Pendleton walking down the hallway. This physician extorts $5,000 a day to ostensibly manage the king's pain. Bridget twists her sponge, letting the contaminated water bleed into her bucket, and catches his facial microexpressions in the marble reflection. The diagnostic signs are completely wrong. A healer losing a patient naturally exhibits a heavy depressive affect. Pendleton shows zero grief. He projects the manic dopamine rush of a sociopath securing his blood money. It confirms a terrifying psychological reality. Greed rots the human empathy center far faster than any physical disease ever could. An elevated manic rhythm infects Pendleton's gait as he whispers to Vincent. Bridget spent years mopping clinical wards before entering this cartel environment. She intimately recognizes the biological scent of genuine terminal decline and the defeated body language of a physician losing a medical battle. Pendleton lacks those markers. He carries the smug pulse of an executioner. Later that evening, the housekeeper corners Bridget. The older woman exhibits acute panic, reporting another girl just abandoned her post. A maid tried adjusting the master suite bedding, and Dominic violently launched a heavy glass at the wall, triggering a permanent flight response. It highlights a harsh psychological reality. Intense fear can either fracture your mind or provide the exact adrenaline spike that finally wakes you up. Bridget methodically folds towels, processing the housekeeper's frantic vocalizations. Tomorrow morning, she becomes the permanent variable assigned to the dreaded master suite. The institutional rules of survival are absolute. Enter the ward, sanitize the floors, and exit immediately. Avoid all visual contact. If the paralyzed narcissist begins a rage episode, submit and remain silent. Bridget provides a compliant nod, but underneath her ribs, a severe autonomic response activates. Every subject in this mansion operates under pure terror of crossing that threshold. Yet, staring at her calloused hands, a dark, adaptive purpose suddenly fuses in her brain. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. Pure danger fiercely calls to our primitive cortex the exact moment we process that we have absolutely nothing left to lose. The atmospheric pressure inside the bedroom is clinically suffocating, triggering an immediate restriction in her airways. The olfactory data is overwhelming sharp rubbing alcohol and the sour biological heat of a high fever. Bridget guides her cart inside, the wheels sinking into the rug. Thick curtains block the sun, enforcing a depressive, sensory-deprived isolation. There, physically swallowed by the massive bed, lies the legendary apex predator. Bridget attempts to suppress her curiosity and obey the survival protocol, but the psychological pull is too strong. The sociopath who previously dominated the city is reduced to a decaying organic shell, his skin a necrotic gray. Severe illness violently strips away our artificial armor, revealing the fragile, terrifying humanity we try so desperately to repress. Deep, necrotic circles drag down Dominic's orbital bones. The former kingpin is helplessly tethered to a medical pole, receiving a steady intravenous drip. He remains in a catatonic state as Bridget initiates her routine. She presses her physical form against the perimeter of the room, dusting shelves while suppressing her respiratory rate to avoid detection. It is a painful psychological truth. When your environment treats you as a worthless burden, you master the trauma response of becoming entirely invisible. She glides across the floorboards like silent vapor. Suddenly, the brass door engages with a sharp click. Dr. Pendleton strides into the isolation ward, Vincent trailing closely. Pure panic instantly floods Bridget's central nervous system. She flattens her spine against the darkest corner, forcing her muscles to remain completely rigid. Concealed in the unlit margins, Bridget regulates her breathing. Vincent demands a medical update, layering his tone with artificial empathy. Underneath that mask, you and I can easily diagnose the raw impatience of a predator circling a dying host. Pendleton approaches the bedside, his clinical detachment masking deep sadism. He announces the deterioration is perfectly on schedule, noting the induced paralysis has compromised the lungs. He frames it as a tragedy, but his body language screams arrogant victory. Vincent leans over the mattress, testing if the alpha can process their treason. The doctor issues a dark chuckle, guaranteeing the synthetic narcotics have wiped the cerebral cortex blank. He casually classifies the most lethal man in the state as brain dead. Trust is truly the sharpest psychological knife we ever hand over to our enemies. Fighting her survival instincts, Bridget risks a visual sweep, locking onto Dominic's pale face. His eyelids remain half shut, pupils fixed. Suddenly, breaking through the chemical fog of sedatives, she observes a terrifying neurological response. A sharp muscle spasm fires deep inside his jaw. The muscles clench with a silent screaming fury. A severe chill runs down Bridget's spine as the horrifying clinical reality clicks into place. The kingpin is trapped inside a failing biological cage, but his auditory processing is intact. He hears every syllable. The psychopathic doctor casually draws clear liquid into a syringe, making a cruel joke about pain management as he injects the neurotoxin into the intravenous line. Vincent asks for a final timeline. Pendleton flashes a wicked grin, promising terminal cardiac arrest within weeks. It is utterly terrifying how easily pure evil camouflages itself behind a pristine white medical coat. Examine this case file with me tonight. You and I are observing a textbook study of situational trauma inside a collapsing criminal empire. The subject, Bridget, exhibits acute hyperarousal. She presses a trembling hand over her mouth to suppress an autonomic terror response. From the shadows, she watches a methodical homicide. The physician discards a vial into the wastebasket, exiting and sealing the heavy doors. The resulting acoustic vacuum is psychologically crushing. For 5 agonizing minutes, this marginalized worker suspends her own respiration. Opposing the megalomaniac narcissist, Vincent guarantees her immediate death.
The clinical reality of human behavior is deeply unsettling.
Pure survival often demands severing our emotional empathy to the desperate agony of others. When her rubber soles scrape the floor, a spike in cortisol arrests her breathing. She makes direct visual contact with Dominic. The subject suffers from induced paralysis, yet his bloodshot corneas track her micro-movements. They project a hostility that registers physically on Bridget's nervous system. We are documenting the agony of an apex predator betrayed by familial narcissists, effectively entombed within his own biology. Bridget swallows her rising panic, knuckles blanching around her cloth as she approaches the ruined syndicate leader, mumbling an excuse about the waste bin. Power, structurally speaking, is merely a cognitive illusion. You can dominate a metropolis, but ultimately, Your physiological survival might depend entirely on the overlooked laborer sweeping your floors. Let us examine the forensic evidence she extracts from the scene. Rummaging through hazardous waste, she retrieves the discarded amber vial. Hours later, isolated in her apartment, the monitor's blue light illuminates her pale complexion. She peels back the label to reveal the chemical compound, thallium sulfate. Processing this data, she experiences acute vasoconstriction blood drains from her face. This is no therapeutic agent. It is a toxic heavy metal synthesized for rodent extermination. The pathology of betrayal is remarkably consistent across criminal history. The most lethal threats to our existence rarely announce themselves. Instead, they integrate quietly into our daily protocols, camouflaged flawlessly as acts of familial care. The sadism of this execution transcends conventional homicide. The toxin is imperceptible, degrading the nervous system to mimic organic neurological decline. Furthermore, the secondary compound is a profound surgical paralytic. The physician is orchestrating localized torture, paralyzing the vocal cords to ensure the subject's complete subjugation. Bridget leans back, absorbing the acute physiological stress. She holds empirical proof of an assassination in her trembling hand. Attempting to involve law enforcement would trigger immediate, fatal retaliation from the syndicate. The psychiatric reality of our fractured society is incredibly unforgiving. Taking ethical action against sociopathic forces often requires the absolute sacrifice of your own psychological safety. Vincent exhibits the traits of a megalomaniac narcissist, having compromised law enforcement to insulate his power. If Bridget alerts the syndicate loyalists, her lack of corroborated evidence ensures her rapid elimination. The sole variable capable of disrupting this sociopathic design is a paralyzed entity confined to a medical bed. By morning, reigned as the estate glass, Bridget times her entry, exploiting behavioral patterns she has catalogued with clinical precision. The physician is absent. The narcissistic cousin is occupied. She crosses the threshold and secures the heavy deadbolt. From a behavioral standpoint, true resilience is never reliant on massive institutional support. It is the individual capacity to confront severe sociopathic threats in absolute, terrifying isolation. The deadbolt's engagement creates a sharp acoustic anomaly in the chamber. The subject, Dominic, exhibits severe respiratory depression. Above his cranium, the intravenous apparatus continues administering the necrotic chemical agent. Operating under extreme adrenal stress, Bridget approaches the mechanism. Despite pronounced physical tremors, she overrides her fear response, clamping the tubing to halt the toxic rhythm. Taking shears concealed in her uniform, she severs the line with a definitive snap. Instantly, the subject's neurological pathways reignite, his gray corneas snapping open with violent intensity. We frequently observe that catastrophic biological decline can be dramatically reversed by a single, terrifying intervention of everyday human agency. The subject fights the heavy neurosuppression of the paralytics, generating a fractured vocalization as his degraded larynx demands her identity. Bridget notes his severe deterioration, yet he retains the aura of intimidation inherent to apex dominance. Her cardiovascular rate accelerates, but she anchors her posture, stating she has terminated the chemical infusion. His megalomaniac ego reacts defensively. He attempts to summon security, but neurological damage limits him to an ineffective wheeze. She clinically advises him to conserve his limited oxygen. This presents a profound psychological metric. Genuine influence is never measured by the vast empire's won constructs, but by the solitary individuals who intervene when that artificial power structure inevitably collapses. Bridget dismantles his cognitive framework. You and I can observe the clinical shift here. She informs him his security is compromised, his narcissistic cousin is stealing his assets, and his physician is orchestrating his demise. His pupillary response shows shock, transitioning into the hyperfocus of a vendetta. Bridget elevates the vial, presenting the data, a lethal mix of rodenticide and paralytics. His decline is not organic, it is a familial assassination. The silence amplifies this trauma. Consider the psychiatric weight of this. The most profound wounds we endure are typically inflicted by the exact individuals we authorized to access our vulnerabilities. Dominic processes the toxin visually, then anchors his predatory focus directly onto her. The subject finally registers her as a distinct entity. Forcing his degraded vocal cords to engage, he queries her motivation. Why compromise her survival for a deposed authority? Bridget regulates her respiration. She states that permitting his isolated exploration violates her moral baseline. Through a lens of shared trauma, she reveals her history of marginalization, the psychological damage of allowing external forces to dictate one's value. The syndicate has reduced him to disposable waste. True empathy operates exactly like this, a quiet bridge, constructed by two traumatized psychologies discovering mutual recognition in the darkest of environments. Dominic processes this pathological honesty, closing his eyes and emitting a dry, dysregulated vocalization resembling a deeply bitter laugh. The subject interrogates her true identity, highly suspicious of sudden altruism. She minimizes her status, identifying solely as Bridget, the maintenance staff. He repeats the designation, his vocal resonance increasing as the neurotoxin metabolizes. Despite motor deficits, he warns that the conspirators will detect the missing chemical agent. However, Bridget exhibits exceptional anticipatory logic, producing saline to replicate the intravenous feed. His ocular focus locks onto hers, demonstrating a spike in adrenaline as his predatory architecture comes back online. The clinical profile of the helpless victim is officially overwritten by the resurrected sociopath. We learn repeatedly that extreme arrogance is always an abuser's most fatal vulnerability. His cognitive function is restored. Despite a failing nervous system, his executive functioning remains hyper-vigilant. He calculates the probability of her murder. If his narcissistic cousin discovers this, rapid execution is a mercy. Bridget regulates her affect, extracting the saline substitute. Suddenly, the subject lowers his psychopathic defenses, instructing her to use his familiar identifier, Dom. Bridget experiences an autonomic spike. This calculated intimacy from a predator constitutes a profound trauma bonding technique, solidifying her psychological investment. Authentic trust is frequently forged under extreme psychological duress. Maintaining eye contact, he details his biological deficit. The toxic metals are locked within his skeletal structure. He urgently requires a specific chemical antagonist, Prussian blue. He clarifies this compound will flush the toxic metals. Bridget commits to the procurement, but imposes a strict parameter. He must maintain the somatic presentation of terminal decline, or his megalomaniac cousin will execute him. Dom exhibits a dysregulated, predatory expression, weaponizing her socioeconomic invisibility against the Syndicate-S cognitive blind spots. As she establishes the saline fusion, his fingers grasp her wrist. You and I must recognize the clinical significance here. While his motor strength is compromised, the psychopathic conviction driving that connection paralyzes her flight response. Profound psychological dependencies consistently form in moments of absolute vulnerability. He vocalizes a violent ideation, promising catastrophic retaliation upon his physiological recovery. Let us examine this clinical baseline together, you and I. We observe Dominic, a megalomaniacal narcissist, utilizing extreme psychological manipulation from his deathbed. His whisper is broken, yet calibrated to exploit Bridget. He promises to eradicate anyone who made her feel insignificant, a calculated hook for a fractured psyche. She is a marginalized cleaner. He is an apex predator. In her hesitation, we witness the foundational stages of a traumatic bond, a variant of Stockholm Syndrome, where the caretaker adopts the monster. Stepping into the corridor, her previous identity dissolves. The psychiatric reality here is absolute. Psychological survival often demands the complete incineration of our former selves to adapt to acute trauma. The environment mirrors her internal regulation. The freezing wind tears through her coat as she pursues this irrational mission. Attempting to secure a restricted compound on a meager income is statistically impossible, yet her cognitive schema was forged in chronic deprivation. She understands the underground networks where societal regulations fail. Riding the subway into a desolate sector of the city, her physiological fear response is severe. Her hands display violent tremors. She is exhibiting acute panic, yet her behavioral momentum remains uninterrupted. She is risking her freedom for a violent criminal, driven by an unhealthy psychological enmeshment. We see a fundamental behavioral truth here. Resilience is never the absence of severe anxiety, but the clinical decision to sustain forward motion despite the panic. She stops beneath the erratic neon glow of a disgraced pharmacy. Inside operates Albert Finch, an antisocial personality stripped of his medical credentials decades ago for chemical distribution. He now preys upon a clinically desperate demographic. Finch presents as heavily compromised, barely elevating his gaze from the filthy counter as the door mechanism engages. He processes Bridget through a lens of profound superficiality, noting her physical exhaustion, and instantly deploys verbal degradation. Igniting a cigarette, he projects his own internalized misery, mockingly stating they lack weight loss medication. This abrasive stimulus offers a stark diagnostic lesson. Social hierarchies will aggressively attempt to quantify your psychological worth based on nothing more than visual symptoms of fatigue. The verbal assault registers on her facial affect, an accumulation of systemic trauma she has endured for years. Yet, we observe an immediate cognitive reframe. She visualizes the dominant gaze of her pathological anchor, drawing a maladaptive strength from the criminal narcissist. Approaching the barrier, she forcefully deposits her entire life savings in $100 bills. This represents her total financial security, liquidated for a trauma bond. Modulating her vocal tone to a flat, sociopathic calm, she rejects his insult. She specifically requests a large quantity of Prussian blue. The illicit chemist exhibits an immediate startle response, paralyzed by the sudden shift in power dynamics. The clinical takeaway is fascinating. Assertive dominance emerges precisely when an individual structurally rejects the psychological limitations imposed by external abusers. Analyze the shift in milieu here. You and I recognize the extreme risk of acquiring such a heavily monitored compound. The chemist drops his dismissive defense mechanisms, adopting a paranoid hypervigilance. He cautions that regulatory agencies track this substance designed specifically to eradicate lethal heavy metals from the circulatory system. Probing for a confession, he questions her motives regarding pest control. Bridget displays absolute emotional blunting. Her facial musculature remains rigid as she taps $2,000 against the counter, non-verbally enforcing a vow of silence. Finch processes the risk and reward, confiscates the currency, and slides an unlabeled container into her possession. The behavioral lesson is quite clinical. In a severely disordered environment, a sociopathic level of composure will consistently neutralize environmental threats. The pharmacist outlines a severe administration protocol. He dictates the 50 capsules must be pulverized, warning of a side effect profile that includes visceral cramping and a distinct blue staining of the oral mucosa. He presents a grim physiological reality. The extreme shock of the remedy could induce fatal cardiac arrest. Bridget absorbs this data without visible distress, returning to the hostile elements. Her sympathetic nervous system is highly activated, heart rate elevated. She must now bypass elite security forces with contraband. Curiously, her chronic social isolation manifests as tactical camouflage. To the heavily armed guards, a fatigued maintenance worker simply does not register as a threat vector. The observable lesson is profound. The exact characteristics that invite societal neglect can be weaponized as the ultimate method of infiltration. To the security apparatus, she remains a subclinical stimulus. At 10:15, she infiltrates the primary suite and secures the door. Dominic exhibits extreme hyperarousal, his ocular movements mirroring a trapped predator. His physiological deterioration is acute, deprived of the paralytic. His central nervous system is currently processing unmitigated agony. Cold sweat covers his skin. His respiratory mechanics are audibly compromised. He vocalizes his disbelief regarding her return, validating his inherent distrust of human attachment. Bridget closes the distance, displaying textbook codependency, reassuring him of her devotion. She prepares the mortar and pestle for the intervention. The psychological truth here is undeniable. Pathological loyalty is permanently forged, not during stability, but through shared participation in extreme and violent trauma.
Motor tremors plague her extremities as she reduces the compound to powder.
The
patient monitors her with compromised vision, inquiring about the corrupt physician.
Bridget details a highly complex sabotage sequence. She executed a rapid substitution of the intravenous fluids, manipulating the medical environment to blind the attending doctor. This indicates a high level of executive functioning under extreme duress. Dominic issues a ragged breath, positively reinforcing her sociopathic adaptability. As she prepares the dosage, she relays the clinical warnings regarding severe internal trauma. The narcissist merely projects an effect of absolute invulnerability. He has survived kinetic warfare. The psychological takeaway is stark. When trapped within a pathological hierarchy, survival depends upon discreetly rewriting operational protocols, while the abusers remain unaware. Let us observe this critical intervention together, you and I. Bridget provides cervical support, her touch bridging their trauma bond. His dermal temperature is clinically hypothermic. She administers the liquid. The patient's compromised tract immediately rejects the substance, triggering a severe gag reflex. Yet, his megalomaniacal drive forces ingestion. A violent spasm seizes his frame. His spine contorts into severe hyperextension, accompanied by a primal vocalization of distress. Jugular distension is prominent. Bridget exhibits acute panic, forcefully restraining his shoulders. Suddenly, his previously paralyzed motor neurons fire, violently convulsing his hands. This presentation offers a severe psychiatric truth. True healing is essentially a violent biological war. Cellular recovery always mandates an agonizing confrontation with the deeply embedded toxins. His digits embed into her soft tissue with uncontrolled kinetic force. Fueled by a flood of cortisol and severe pain reception, the pressure forces an involuntary vocalization of distress from her, yet her pathological attachment prevents withdrawal. She maintains close physical proximity, functioning as his primary grounding mechanism during the neurological storm, offering verbal soothing until the seizure subsides. The kingpin drops back, his respiratory rate dangerously elevated. The chemical has stained his oral cavity an unnatural hue. He regains ocular focus to find her maintaining her vigil, registering the subdermal hemorrhaging he just inflicted upon her arms. The diagnostic lesson here is profound. Clinical strength is not measured by the capacity for violent domination. It is found in the stoic endurance required to stabilize a fractured mind. Analyzing his own restored motor function, he vocalizes his cognitive dissonance regarding the movement. Bridget displays emotional lability, laughing through tears, establishing the parameters of their shared psychosis, total secrecy. For 14 days, the clinical environment transforms into a theater of deception. The compromised physician administers the neurotoxin, unaware the submissive caretaker disrupts the delivery matrix. Simultaneously, his familial rival, Vincent, displays classic narcissistic grandiosity, mocking his catatonic relative. Vincent vocalizes his hostile takeover, oblivious to the fact that his target retains full cognitive processing. The patient catalogs these data points, constructing a homicidal framework. The behavioral lesson is chillingly precise. Sustained, calculated silence functions as the ultimate psychological countermeasure. Observe this final developmental phase with me. To maintain operational security, Bridget adopts the nocturnal observation schedule. Within the quiet architecture, the marginalized laborer becomes the primary psychological anchor for a sociopathic monarch. His biological rehabilitation is aggressive and strictly covert. The chemical agent actively chelates the heavy metals from his vascular system. Epidermal pallor improves, and the involuntary muscle fasciculations cease. By day 14, his core strength allows independent elevation. Illuminated by artificial light, the apex predator reintegrates his dominant persona. His vocal affect returns to a threatening baseline as he extracts actionable intelligence regarding his external environment. The ultimate psychiatric lesson is definitive. The most catastrophic psychological regenerations incubate entirely in the dark, shielded from the observation of the prey. Let us examine this pathology together, you and I, observing two fractured minds. Bridget sits trembling, clutching a laundry basket like a psychological shield. She murmurs about the freezing rain, describing her apartment as a brutal icebox. Dominic reacts with the instinct of a megalomaniac narcissist, instantly offering a heated penthouse. Yet, Bridget merely gives a weary smile. She did not save a dying kingpin for a real estate upgrade. This rejection completely shatters his distorted reality. He begs to know why she saved him at all. We must remember this simple lesson. The most unbreakable human bonds are never purchased. They are forged strictly through the crucible of shared suffering. The room is thick with overlapping trauma. The apex predator is fully conscious, his cold gaze locked onto a terrified woman. He demands to know why she would risk everything to pull a dying monster from the edge. Bridget freezes, twisting the coarse fabric of her uniform, displaying the posture of someone crushed by lifelong marginalization. She confesses a haunting truth. She understands what it means to be trapped in a body the world discarded. To his rivals, he is a walking corpse. To the guests she serves, she is an invisible punchline. They are two ghosts entirely erased by society. She simply wanted to prove the observers wrong. Hold on to this vital lesson. Never underestimate the people society casually throws away. They watch from the shadows, and they see everything. The clinical silence of the room presses down like a physical weight. Dominic shatters the tension, using his deep voice to draw his target closer. Bridget hesitates, her pulse hammering in a classic trauma response. She edges toward the mattress, painfully hyper-aware of her cheap uniform and his history with flawless women. But Dominic reaches out with remarkable motor control. He does not grab her. His fingers gently wrap around her hip, resting against her waist with calculated reverence. Bridget freezes completely, a soft gasp escaping her lips. His cold eyes lock onto hers, murmuring that the rest of the world is entirely blind. Remember this psychological truth. A person's true worth is often only recognized by those who have spent their entire lives adapting to the pitch black. He whispers that his associates surround themselves with empty illusions. To his predatory mind, she is the most authentic subject he has ever encountered. He clinically notes she possesses more psychological resilience than his entire crew of enforcers. Tracing her rough apron, he asks if she truly believes he views her as a punchline. Pulling her closer, he declares he sees a survivor who walked into a cage and refused to fracture. Bridget gasps, her vision blurring with tears of sudden validation. His terrifying possessiveness becomes intoxicating, a textbook trigger for a trauma bond. She is his new anchor. Take this to heart. True courage, no matter how quietly it operates, will always demand a profound respect from the dark. She reaches out, trembling fingers sinking into his dark hair. The narcissist briefly surrenders to a woman society discarded. It is a fascinating clinical equilibrium. But do not get comfortable. That psychological sanctuary shatters by morning. Bridget is pushing her mop when Dr. Pendleton bursts from the master's suite. His arrogant baseline behavior is gone. His face is pale, his motor skills failing as he dials a phone. Her deeply ingrained survival trauma takes over. She ducks behind a marble pillar, suppressing her breathing. She hears the doctor hiss to Vincent, his voice tight with acute panic. Their deadly secret is bleeding out. Remember this harsh truth. In any human structure built on ruthless betrayal, peace is always the very first casualty. You and I are going to analyze this acute panic response together. Pendleton is sweating through a frantic call with Vincent, the relative orchestrating this betrayal. He just processed the patient's blood work, and the biological data is impossible. The paralytic agent is washing out of his system. Pendleton is unraveling, whining that it defies logic because nobody except the invisible cleaning staff enters the room. But cornered subjects always regress to lethal survival tactics. Tonight, Pendleton plans to inject a massive dose of potassium chloride to simulate a fatal cardiac event. Let this be a vital lesson to carry with you. If you ever decide to bury a dominant predator, your dirt better be heavy enough to keep him down. Otherwise, the open grave belongs entirely to you. Hidden in the shadows, Bridget experiences a massive spike in cortisol. They are scheduling an execution. She endures an agonizing delay until the doctor vacates the corridor. Once the threat leaves, her flight response triggers. She bolts, throwing herself into the master suite and frantically engaging the heavy locks. Inside, Dominic is out of bed. His muscles strain through brutal push-ups, aggressively fighting to reclaim his physical dominance. He registers her terrified micro-expressions, and his ruthless sociopathic baseline instantly returns. He demands the intel. Gasping, she shatters the illusion. The doctor knows he is healing, and the lethal injection is coming tonight. Listen closely to this truth. Never wait for a gathering storm to break before you decide to reinforce your defensive walls. When Bridget explains the planned cardiac event, a violent cognitive shift occurs in Dominic. This extreme emotional regulation is exactly why he thrives as an apex predator. He does not panic. His brain immediately switches to cold mathematics. He calculates he has the motor control to fire a weapon, but eliminating 30 armed guards is a statistical impossibility. He needs external loyalists, but his treacherous relative stole his device. Suddenly, a chilling smirk cuts across his face. He reveals a perfectly engineered contingency. An encrypted phone and a coded ledger sit buried in a floor safe inside his old office. Take this deeply to heart. Always bury a silent backup plan in the shadows where your arrogant enemies would never think to dig. The clinical nightmare accelerates. Vincent, driven by narcissistic envy, claimed that office as his personal trophy room. Dominic explains the encrypted device will summon a strike team to neutralize the threat. But the variables are practically suicidal. The study sits on a guarded floor where Vincent is hosting a gathering. Dominic grips Bridget, anchoring his sociopathic stare into her fragile psyche. He needs her to infiltrate the hostile environment and return before the lethal injection arrives. Trembling, she begs to know how a traumatized maid sneaks past trained killers. His psychological reframing is brilliant. He simply tells her she is a ghost. Think about this profound truth. The exact trait making you invisible to an arrogant world can suddenly be weaponized into your most lethal advantage. Dominic programs his subject with calculated behavioral instructions. He tells her to regulate her nervous system and weaponize their cognitive bias. He implants a numerical code into her memory, mapping a false compartment beneath a rug. Stripping away his dominant persona, he employs the ultimate manipulation. Confessing his survival rests entirely on her. Bridget processes this terrifying shift. He is a diagnosed sociopath, yet he provides the only validation she has ever known. Her trauma bond solidifies. She swallows her anxiety and agrees. The mansion now hums, with a lethal tension, with Vincent mimicking a king downstairs. Remember this well. True psychological loyalty is never secured with empty phrases. It is only forged in the absolute fire of a shared existential threat. The environment reeks of illegitimate authority. Bridget grips her cart, inching down the corridor while battling extreme nervous system activation. Her drab uniform acts as a fragile psychological shield. Her heart rate elevates so violently, she fears the armed sentries will detect the rhythm. Up ahead, two enforcers block the threshold, but the sociopath's behavioral prediction proves flawless. Experiencing classic, inattentional blindness, their eyes slide right over her as if she were mere background noise. She bypasses their lethal perimeter, fading into the wing where Vincent established his fraudulent command center. She quietly breaches the heavy door. Always remember this lesson. A man's suffocating arrogance will consistently blind him to the quietest anomalies standing right in front of him. You and I can instantly read the pathology of this stolen room. It radiates deep-seated insecurity. Vincent erased the prior elegance, replacing it with the loud overcompensation typical of an inferior narcissistic profile. Bridget drops to her knees beside the desk, deliberately dissociating from the physical pain. She shoves back the rug, her frantic fingers conducting a tactile search until they register a microscopic structural flaw. Applying pressure, a concealed keypad smoothly rises from the floorboards. Operating under massive adrenaline tremors, she inputs 472911. The psychological truth hidden here is profound. Loud, aggressive confidence is usually nothing but a fragile defense mechanism. Genuine power stays quietly buried in the dark, patiently calculating the precise moment to strike. You and I are going to unpack this clinical case file, frame by frame. The lighting is dim as Bridget pries back the floorboard. From the dust, she unearths the Don's hidden arsenal, a heavy black satellite phone. She buries the cold device deep within the folds of her maid uniform. Her perceived insignificance provides the ultimate camouflage. Before she can smooth the rug, an arrogant thud echoes from the hall. It is Vincent. His entitled voice demands his missing contracts. Suffocating dread grips her throat. The psychological reality here is brutally simple. True survival in a predatory environment is never about a flawless plan. It is entirely about how rapidly the human brain adapts the very second a lethal trap snaps shut. Driven by sheer baseline instinct, Bridget snatches a spray bottle and a rag. She pivots, frantically scrubbing the glass as the heavy oak doors violently swing open. Vincent strides into the room. Flanked by muscle, he stops dead. His predatory eyes lock onto her for 3 agonizing seconds. The silence turns venomous. Bridget tightens her knuckles, terrified of the contraband burning against her ribs. Vincent sneers with absolute disgust, demanding to know why a peasant is polluting his sanctuary. Without hesitation, she collapses her posture, adopting the pathetic mask of a trembling worker. We learn a vital behavioral truth in this dark moment. When a megalomaniac corners you, the most brilliant defense strategy is often to weaponize their narcissism and simply play the fool. Bridget deliberately weaponizes her autonomic fierce response. She forces her vocal cords into a trembling pitch, perfectly embodying the helpless subordinate. She stammers out frantic apologies. Vincent glares down at her shaking frame. For one fraction of a second, genuine suspicion flickers across his features, but his overwhelming superiority complex quickly smothers the thought. He cruelly dismisses her, barking at her to leave his office. Bridget keeps her gaze fastened to the floor, whispering apologies as she retreats. The pathology of clinical narcissism is vividly captured right here. Fragile egos construct a false reality. Unchecked pride will permanently blind a predator to the quiet, lethal threats standing directly in their line of sight. Let us step into the hallway, where the physiological weight of the moment finally hits. Every step Bridget takes feels like wading through thick cement. If Vincent's narcissism had not blinded him to the rigid shape concealed beneath her uniform, she would be a corpse. The massive enforcer tracks her exit with dead eyes. The door clicks shut, and the crushing gravity of her survival crashes down. Bridget collapses against the cold metal, pulling desperate air into her burning lungs. She navigated a behavioral minefield and emerged entirely intact. You and I can take a profound clinical lesson from this escape. Always maintain your baseline humility. The peripheral figures you casually look down upon are often the exact variables holding your ultimate fate in their trembling hands. Her perceived insignificance purchased a second chance at life, but the clock is ruthlessly ticking. Abandoning caution, Bridget throws herself into the service elevator, slamming the button for the 3rd floor. It is 8:45 in the evening. The shadow of mortality is creeping through the estate. She sprints into the master's suite. We observe Dominic. He sits upright, sharply dressed in black. His physical form is hollowed out and starved, but his psychological aura is terrifyingly absolute. The megalomaniac kingpin has finally risen for war. He demands his prize, and she presents the heavy phone. Life teaches us this unyielding behavioral reality. When you can feel systemic pressure breaking on the horizon, You must mentally fortify yourself to survive the violent flood. The expression washing over Dominic's face is unfiltered psychopathy. We see the calculated smile of an apex predator who finally has his prey trapped. The glowing screen illuminates the bedroom, untraceable and fully charged. His sunken eyes blaze as he congratulates Bridget for pulling off the impossible. He promises her a front-row seat to the obliteration of his bloodline. His trembling fingers punch in a number buried deep within his long memory. When a voice answers, Dominic speaks with the bone-chilling authority of an absolute sovereign. He states that he is back, ordering the strike team to gather. The psychological lesson woven into this scene is undeniable. Vengeance is a toxic compulsion best executed ice cold, leaving absolutely zero room for human empathy. Stick with me here. This is where their underworld hierarchy violently fractures. Dominic delivers cold parameters into the receiver. He declares cousin Vincent a malignant narcissist and the corrupt doctor a dead man. He demands them both terminated within the hour. Carlo's shocked gasp crackles through the speaker, but Dominic growls that he is reclaiming his territory. He drops the phone and slowly rises. His pale muscles tremble from months of atrophy, yet he plants his feet like an immovable force. Bridget watches in traumatized awe as his shadow engulfs the wall. He retrieves a heavy 1911 pistol and sharply racks the slide. Let this clinical observation remind you of a core truth. Never count a resilient survivor out until their cognitive functions have permanently ceased. The metallic clack of the pistol slide echoes like an auditory trigger for violence. In the corridor, approaching footsteps pair with the squeal of a medical cart. Bridget's pupils dilate with terror as she whispers the doctor's name. Dominic locks onto the doors. His face hardens with the focus of a psychopath as he levels his weapon. He commands Bridget to melt into the shadows. She scrambles into the alcove, suppressing her panic. The doorknob turns. Dr. Pendleton steps inside, utterly blind to his imminent termination, holding a syringe filled with lethal toxins. We analyze this tragic irony, often in criminal behavior. The exact moment an aggressor arrogantly believes they possess absolute control is usually the second their own psychological blind spots seal their doom. Let us examine the psychology of this confrontation. Pendleton pushes his cart forward, completely dissociated from the murder he is about to commit. He whispers that it is time to end this charade. As his retinas adjust, the blood drains from his face. The mattress is empty. Before his brain processes this anomaly, a massive hand erupts from the shadows, brutally compressing his trachea. Dominic lifts the doctor, slamming him against the wall. The syringe scatters across the rug. Pendleton's eyes bulge with horror as he stares into the vengeful face of his former patient. Dominic whispers a chilling greeting, pressing the cold steel directly to his temple. The behavioral lesson is absolute. Unchecked arrogance consistently constructs the very trap that guarantees your destruction. The resurrected Don leans in close, his tone dropping to a steady cadence. He clinically mocks the doctor about searching for a permanent cure. The psychological malice radiating from Dominic is absolute. Pendleton dangles helplessly, his motor functions failing as he kicks at empty space. He chokes out rationalizations, his face flushing a hypoxic purple. He sobs that Vincent forced his hand, exhibiting classic deflection. Dominic's icy eyes are entirely devoid of empathy. He lowers the doctor just enough for his toes to scrape the floor, driving the pistol barrel against his temple until the metal breaks the skin. We must evaluate this unyielding truth. Adopting a helpless victim mentality at the final hour will never erase the malicious choices you consciously made at the beginning. A drop of blood traces a path down the doctor's face as Dominic strips away every psychological illusion. He calls Arthur out, disgusted that this coward watched him rot in a paralyzed state while serving the narcissist who ordered the hit. Pendleton's nervous is in overdrive. He sobs violently, offering hidden offshore accounts to negotiate his survival. Dominic merely gives a sociopathic smile. He whispers that he does not require financial compensation. He only wants his prescribed medication. With a sickening application of kinetic force, Dominic kicks the doctor's knees backward, dropping him to the floor. The analytical moral echoes loudly here. True psychological integrity is priceless, and no amount of hoarded capital can ever repair a fundamentally corrupted soul. Let us examine this case file together. Dominic displays classic megalomaniacal narcissism here, engineering the ultimate psychological checkmate. With the heavy pistol pressed to Dr. Pendleton's sweating forehead, he tosses the lethal syringe onto the traitor's chest. He offers a horrifying dilemma: push the plunger to stop his own heart, or take a bullet to the stomach and bleed out over 3 agonizing hours. 1. Pendleton begs, a primal panic response. 2. The finger tightens. The doctor's trembling hands wrap around the plastic tube. In my years analyzing the criminal mind, the lesson is always the same. The absolute malice you engineer for another human being will eventually be the very poison that stops your own heart. Pendleton searches his executioner's face for empathy, finding only the cold void of an antisocial personality. With a fractured sob, he drives the needle into his thigh. Dominic steps back, clinically observing the seizures until the subject goes completely still. By the wall, Bridget is paralyzed in a severe fight-or-flight freeze state, terrified by this ruthless display. But observe the cognitive shift. The brutal kingpin disappears. Dominic crosses the room, softening his imposing posture, and gently pulls her shaking hands from her pale face. It is a masterful manipulation of attachment, but it teaches us a chilling reality. True power is knowing exactly when to let the monster out and when to bury it to protect the innocent. Dominic extends a battered hand, his thumb catching a tear cutting down her cheek. He drops his voice into a dark, soothing rhythm. He strips away the illusions, openly confessing his empire runs on blood, yet he vows to burn the city to white ash before letting violence touch her. It is textbook trauma bonding. But that heavy vow shatters instantly when a suppressed gunshot echoes from below. Carlo has breached the perimeter. Watch the narcissist transform back into cold iron. He silently slips spare magazines into his coat, racks his heavy weapon, and pulls Bridget deep into the unlit hallway. The clinical takeaway here is vital. If you build a loyal circle, you must always be the first to stand as their absolute shield. Stick with me here, because you and I are about to watch a velvet palace turn a clinical slaughterhouse. His hand locks over hers, an iron anchor, steadying her in a sudden hurricane of violence. They melt into the heavy shadows of the upper corridor. Below them, a dark symphony of chaos ricochets off the marble. Panicked men's scream as suppressed weapons cough through the cold air. Carlo's team moves like armed phantoms, clearing the estate with terrifying, sociopathic precision. Dominic leads Bridget to the edge of the grand mahogany staircase, pausing in the dim light. This behavioral snapshot captures a vital truth. Peace is just a fragile pane of glass, and when it shatters, you need someone who refuses to run away. In the dim foyer below, traitorous guards bleed out across the marble as Carlo's men secure the floor. Suddenly, an enforcer looks up at the grand staircase and freezes. He lowers his rifle, tapping his earpiece with shaking fingers to whisper that the paralyzed boss is actually walking. Dominic descends like a resurrected predator, returning to reclaim his territory. His broad shoulders physically shield Bridget from the carnage. His voice rolls through the room like low thunder, demanding his cousin's location. Carlo emerges, silently, pointing toward the heavy dining room doors. Look at the psychological dominance here. True authority never begs for attention. People naturally fall into line when they feel your absolute gravity. Carlo analyzes Dominic's steady legs, then looks at the cleaning woman gripping his hand. Asking no questions, he offers a slow nod, murmuring that the corrupt union bosses are trapped inside. Dominic's voice drops into a lethal growl, swearing no one touches Vincent but him. He gently releases Bridget, ordering her to stay back. But observe her trauma response. Running on pure adrenaline and Stockholm Syndrome, she refuses. She stares this terrifying mobster in the eyes, declaring she will not let him out of her sight in case his legs fail. A dark, captivated smirk pulls at Dominic's mouth. The lesson here is deeply profound. Courage is never the absence of fear. It is the conscious choice to hold your ground beside someone. The megalomaniac leans close, whispering that if his nervous system fails, she has permission to drag him the rest of the way. They step up to the massive oak doors. He never reaches for the handles. Instead, he drives his heavy boot into the solid wood with terrifying, calculated force. The brass latch shatters, and the doors violently blow open like a detonated bomb. Inside that lavish room, time stops breathing. Vincent sits at the head of the table, playing the fake king, a crystal glass of scotch, frozen halfway to his lips. 5 corrupt bosses stare at the doorway in paralyzed horror. Remember this vital piece of wisdom. You will never get anywhere knocking politely. Sometimes, you have to physically kick the doors open. The long table is a graveyard of half-eaten steak sticks and bloody contracts. The second Vincent registers the silhouette of his cousin standing upright. Every drop of color drains from his cowardly face. He looks like a guilty man, watching a vengeful ghost claw out of the dirt. His nervous system crashes. The crystal glass slips, shattering against the hardwood, and bleeding amber scotch into the rug. Dominic steps into the harsh glare of the chandelier, radiating a suffocating, predatory power. He casually wishes the terrified room a good evening, asking if he ruined their dessert. His heavy pistol hangs loosely at his thigh. Keep this truth close to your chest. You might enjoy the stolen feast, but the owner always returns to collect. Pay close attention, because you and I are watching a dark tragedy unfold. Bridget presses against the velvet curtains, watching the true psychopath reclaim his throne. Vincent is practically weeping, throwing his hands up in absolute cowardice. He stammers out the desperate excuses, crying that doctors swore Dominic was dying, claiming he only meant to protect the family legacy. It is a sickening, hollow lie born of panic. Dominic steps closer, his heavy boot echoing like an executioner's drum. He drops the crushing reality. He knows Vincent was selling their docs to the mob while paying to pump paralyzing poison into his veins. Hear this lesson clearly. Never drive a knife into a friend's back. The brutal truth will always hunt you down. The union bosses are rapidly decompensating. Hoffman sweats profusely, his voice cracking as he swears they thought the boss was terminal. Dominic does not blink. Without pulling his gaze from his cousin, he softly promises to cut Hoffman's tongue out if he makes another sound. Silence slams down like a vault door. Vincent's stolen swagger evaporates completely. His knees give out, dropping him onto the ruined carpet. He sobs like a terrified child, begging for mercy, screaming that they are family. He finally confesses his bitter jealousy, weeping that he just wanted a taste of the city's respect. Dominic looms over this cowering man with dead eyes. Remember this undeniable fact. You cannot steal your way into genuine respect. Dominic coldly tells his cousin that respect is never earned by poisoning a paralyzed man. Suddenly, the psychological tension shatters. A union boss tied to the Russian mob realizes the megalomaniac will not leave any loose ends breathing tonight. Desperation takes over. His hand slides into his jacket, reaching for a hidden revolver. But Bridget is watching from the dark corners like a hawk. She catches the unnatural twitch of his shoulder. She does not freeze. Fueled by the profound Stockholm syndrome that binds her to her protector, she screams a warning and lunges directly into the line of fire. Take this vital truth to heart. Fair weather friends are meaningless. Genuine loyalty means throwing yourself into the crossfire. Bridget throws her weight against a brass serving cart stacked with silver dishes. It accelerates like a runaway train, smashing into the union boss just as he yanks his revolver free. A sickening crunch of fractured ribs echoes boiling gravy, scalds his legs. The man shrieks in agony, his weapon jerking upward. A stray bullet detonates the crystal chandelier above. Razor-sharp shards rain down like glass snow. Any normal man would have flinched in a panic response. Dominic does not even blink. Moving with terrifying grace, he pivots on his heel, raises his weapon, and drops the traitor with one clean shot between the eyes. Keep this simple reality in mind. Quick thinking will always outmaneuver blind, brute strength. As the smoke clears, acute stress dictates the chaos. Enforcers execute a rapid, subduing maneuver, pressing cold steel into the spines of the syndicate hierarchy. Dominic bypasses them entirely. His gaze locks onto Vincent, whose motor functions are failing under profound neurological shock. Yet, the true clinical anomaly is Bridget. Despite physical trauma, she possesses the fortitude of an apex predator, camouflaged in a faded domestic uniform. Dominic exhibits a rare break in his sociopathic armor, forcing his cousin to acknowledge his fatal cognitive bias against this brilliant woman. Keep this psychological absolute with you. The quiet individuals operating in your periphery often possess a deeply hidden resilience that will dictate your survival when the pressure peaks. Dominic clinically dismantles his cousin, his tone dropping to a controlled frequency. This is a textbook narcissistic collapse. Vincent suffered from grandiose delusions, treating Bridget as an invisible entity rather than a severe cognitive threat. You and I must analyze the raw terror bleeding into Vincent's eyes. Dominic coldly explains how a domestic worker diagnosed the poison protocol, bypassed armed security, and compromised his communications. The usurper's fragile psyche shatters, leaving only a disorganized, hollow laugh echoing off the walls. Internalize this behavioral truth. Unchecked arrogance creates a massive psychological blind spot, completely preventing you from recognizing the formidable power standing right in front of your face. Dominic stands motionless, asserting that the operational control of his empire now belongs to Bridget. Vincent rapidly decompensates, collapsing onto the rug as his survival instincts trigger useless verbal bargaining. A single, catastrophic gunshot neutralizes the room. Vincent's biological functions cease, his delusions pooling into the spilled alcohol. Unbothered by the violent stimuli, Dominic steps over the debris. He discards the firearm and pulls Bridget into a deep embrace, presenting a primitive display of profound attachment. Consider the psychological weight of this moment. Genuine gratitude transcends mere verbal reinforcement. It demands the absolute elevation of the individual who functioned as your primary defense mechanism when your vulnerability was at its peak. Dominic bypasses the armed operatives, diagnosing her intellect as a terrifying behavioral variable. The timeline advances 6 months. The criminal apparatus has undergone a radical evolutionary leap. Yet, the true shock to the underworld is not Dominic's survival. It is the sovereign strategist operating as his equal. Bridget sits in a secure room, adorned in emerald silk and heavy diamonds. The subservient archetype is entirely eradicated. In her place sits a tactician who understands the sociopathic requirements of her domain. Let us extract a core cognitive truth from this evolution. Never permit an arbitrary societal classification to define your operational value. Your capacity to dominate a system always exceeds the superficial metrics assigned by unimaginative observers. Dominic presents a sharp exterior that masks his antisocial traits. His hypervigilance dissolves into an obsessive fixation when he looks at Bridget. She returns his gaze, employing a calculated smirk over her wine to trigger his dopamine response. Dominic leans in, vocalizing his admiration for their shared empire. Bridget intercepts his grandiosity with the pragmatism of a logistical analyst. She instructs him to fund the dock workers, diagnosing a critical vulnerability. If the foundational base is starved, the entire syndicate faces a catastrophic failure. The diagnostic lesson here is paramount. Effective leadership demands the fierce preservation of your baseline assets because those invisible workers maintain the absolute structural integrity of your reality. Dominic exhibits a predatory smile, acknowledging her cognitive processing as his most lethal asset. He suspends his ego to adopt her strategy. This equilibrium shatters when the perimeter is breached. Sal the Snake, a rival displaying textbook histrionic traits, invades the room. He offers Dominic minimal deference, his focus shifting entirely to Bridget. A micro-expression of profound contempt contorts his face. Sal is mentally imprisoned in an archaic framework where women function strictly as ornamental objects. He lacks the neural plasticity to comprehend the apex predator sitting before him. This interaction isolates a crucial lesson. Never evaluate threat levels based on superficial criteria, because terminal power rarely conforms to predictable societal parameters. Sal emits a guttural laugh, degrading Dominic for dining with a subordinate. Observe Bridget's autonomic nervous system here. She exhibits zero sympathetic arousal, lowering her glass to establish predatory eye contact. Dominic suppresses all pre-assault indicators. He moves silently, achieving a dominant tactical position behind Sal. Before the subject processes his catastrophic miscalculation, Dominic applies extreme kinetic force to his cervical spine. Sal's face structure is violently accelerated into the solid mahogany table. Skeletal integrity fails instantly with a sickening crunch. This sudden behavioral correction enforces a rigid evolutionary law. Unregulated narcissistic behavior within a hostile ecosystem will inevitably result in absolutely devastating consequences. Dominic restrains the hemorrhaging subject, his voice saturated with territorial aggression. He clinically informs Sal that his continued oxygen consumption is a privilege. While parasitic organisms like Sal dig graves, Bridget resuscitated a king. Dominic issues a definitive ultimatum, promising extreme violence upon any future disrespect, before transferring the disputed territory to his wife. Sal triggers a desperate flight response, retreating into the night and clutching his fractured cranium. The violent spike dissipates instantly. Dominic recalibrates his focus to his queen, his pupils dilated from the endocrine surge. The psychological absolute is undisputed. An optimal partnership mandates the fierce, immediate defense of your counterpart's status, Completely devoid of hesitation, Dominic steps closer, his sociopathic model immediately deactivating. He kisses her hand, apologizing for the blood. Let us unpack this cognitive shift together. 6 months prior, she entered a lethal environment expecting termination. Instead, she reconditioned the apex predator. She processes the ruined table with an authoritative smile. She utilizes a dark double entendre regarding her past janitorial duties and her current capacity to manage systemic chaos. The invisible laborer did not merely adapt to this ecosystem. She achieved total dominance. The cognitive mandate is absolute. Never internalize the diminished status assigned by external observers. The individual sanitizing the perimeter today possesses the exact analytical framework to entirely subjugate the empire tomorrow. Bridget proves systemic dominance is never achieved through conformity. It is synthesized the moment a subject breaches their parameters to extract true value. Dominic's evolution reveals his most exciting tactical advantage is not a weapons cache. It resides within the intellectually superior partner who reprogrammed his sociopathic pathways. Evaluating the data from that medical room, you and I could predict this outcome. The antagonist fatally hyper-fixated on the king, remaining completely blind to the lateral movements of the queen, dominating the psychological chessboard. If you found value in dissecting Bridget's clinical climb from an invisible worker to the absolute architect of a criminal syndicate, engage the subscribe button. I will see you in our next behavioral evaluation.